Today we're joined by Graham Barrett from Harman Professional. Graham, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Making a long trip a couple of days ago.
Yes, it's great to be back in Sydney town.
Fantastic. You've been around a bit recently? You've been on your travels?
Yes, obviously having a whole suite of new products in the market means getting out and talking to a lot of people about a lot of different things. So a lot of travel around Australia. I was in Korea and Japan the week before last, Perth last week.
You're always on the road. Every time I speak to you, you're off somewhere else.
Yeah, it's after spending many years traveling, you tend to get used to it, but then you never really get used to it. So,
Hotel's a hotel, airport's an airport.
Yeah, it is. I think the travel is just that little bit more. There's a little bit more friction involved in it these days, which none of us enjoy. But
it used to be a luxury, didn't it?
It really did, and it used to be easy.
Showing our age now.
Yeah, we are. Showing our age.
So I guess if we could start maybe by you just telling us a little bit about who you are and your role at Harman Professional and why we're talking today.
Sure. So my responsibility at Harman is in Australia is strategic partnerships. So I look after our direct relationships with our large customers. So predominantly the university, justice, defence and corporate spaces.
Right.
So people who have large fleets of Harman products, be that AMX, JBL, BSS, and really the focus there is to support those customers with roadmap, direction, strategy, what we're doing with the platforms, where we're going, and very importantly, getting their feedback on what they want from the next generation of AMX or the next generation of BSS. That's, I guess, the official role, and that's what I get paid to do.
It's more than that, though, right?
Having been involved with AMX specifically for nearly 38 years.
Wow.
It's really the brand and the product.
Is that how long it's been?
That's how long. AMX turned 40 in 2022. Yes, and I my first job in AV was in 1988.
Wow.
And I think 1989 I installed my first AMX system.
Wow.
So that's the brand that I've been involved with, and I guess the one I'm most passionate about within the Harman portfolio.
That's almost unheard of these days for that sort of tenure.
You're obviously
doing something right.
Well, either that or just people get used to a face. That's in terms of over and above the strategic partnerships thing. Obviously, I'm very involved in particularly the AMX brand in we call it evangelizing that brand within the end user sector, within the integration market, obviously with consultants and the whole end-to-end supply chain, working closely with our distributors in places like Australia, Korea, Japan, New Zealand. And really, it's all about trying to understand what problems people are being faced with today, be that the end user or the integrator or the consultant, and how these new platforms can help solve those problems.
Yeah, that is a common theme. Everybody I've spoken to so far on the podcast, at some point the conversation comes down to the fact that we are inherent problem solvers.
Correct. And that's I think always been the philosophy behind AMX. It's to make technology simpler. It's to remove that friction that is generally between us and the technology, or more importantly, us and the outcome that we want from the technology. Yeah. So with any new product or platform or solution, you're always trying to find new problems to solve. And often it's a case of actually really getting deeper into workflows and business logic and business flow.
Yeah, every business is different, right?
Correct.
Especially when you look at education, which we're heavily in.
Exactly, and it's a big part of what I do, as is justice, as is defence.
Yeah.
And the problems are always a little bit different. But then saying, okay, here we have this new feature set of this widget, for example, and understanding how those feature sets can help solve the problems. Yeah. And that's really what I've been doing, particularly over the last couple of years, as we've brought a whole new suite of AMX specifically products to market, next generation control, next generation networked AV, identifying, okay, here is a feature, what problem does it solve for? Ultimately for the end user, for the person actually in the room, but also for the administrators of the space, the people who actually spend the money, the people who manage and own that technology. Yeah. So it's a fascinating time to be alive,
Yeah.
bringing new platforms to market. It also means a lot of flying around the country and talking to people. So,
isn't it just? So that's interesting as well. Do you look at user experiences from the physical end user of a device, say education, for example, the lecturer in the room, or from the AV teams that are highly responsible for this stuff working, or is it a bit of both?
I think it is definitely a bit of both. I think if your platform doesn't enable the end user in some way, then you're probably not delivering value to the customer who is the in the education space.
We have multiple customers, don't
we?
We
do, and it's interesting. We talk often in our business about internal consultants.
Yeah.
So, when we talk about a university and the university AV team as the end user, they're actually not the end user, they're an internal consultant. The end user is ultimately the student, the person consuming that education. The academic is arguably not the end user in that sort of scenario. So you need to understand that flow and where the information, because ultimately this is all about the flow of information, whether we're in a training environment, whether we're in a meeting, whether we're at a
government control
center, whether we're at a stadium, whether we're at it's all about the flow of information. And understanding the stakeholders in the flow of that information, what they require from their particular component of that supply chain of information, not of widgets. Is really I guess where we can add value as part of that process. And to your point though, it's a common mistake to think that that internal consultant or that external consultant for that matter is actually the end user. The end user is the person with the finger pressing the touch panel or with the ears listening to the audio.
Right. So. And both parties, I guess, hold our destiny in their hands equally.
Absolutely.
If you've got an AV team that's happy and satisfied, that's one thing, but are their end users hitting the sad face on the survey button every time, and then whose problem is that? So it's a really complex world.
It is, and it's and understanding and ensuring you solve the problems of all of those.
Right down the chain.
All of those members of that chain is critical.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's as simple as building a product or a platform that's incredibly open. And really that's the business we're in, is that custom AV environment. And sometimes it's making a product which is incredibly closed, as you see in things like Teams rooms, where the entire experience is locked down.
Some great Teams memes at the moment. I'm enjoying those.
Yeah. So it's an important thing to understand what conversation and what tying that problem statement to a feature is kind of the
where the value lies. Yeah. It's a really interesting space. It's always. I mean, I'm fairly new into AV, as you well know now. So, got to know each other over the last couple of years. And I'm only just really now understanding just how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Oh, it's.
In terms of data and flow and who controls what, internal ownership, multiple stakeholders, multiple third-party stakeholders.
And you look at universities are one of our very big common customers, and I had a meeting today where a gentleman was explaining how he has started, financed, taken to market, and sold companies. In the same amount of time it's taken him to discuss an idea in a university, and still not actually got to the end point of delivering on that idea.
Yeah.
So, understanding that complexity is also an important part of it.
It's one thing I found when I first joined the business as well, was just getting your head around for want of a better term, the deal cycle as we're bringing a new customer in, and just how long, when Paul was talking to me about that, it can take years sometimes from an initial conversation with what would become a customer to us deploying software. Can be 2 years.
Oh,
more. Sometimes it's a lot quicker, and it's getting faster now. I think as people, more companies understand the need for what companies like you and ours are trying to achieve. But it's still not a quick exercise by any stretch.
Not at all. And you go into areas like government and defence, and it's even worse. I've got a current project which literally started 7 years ago to deliver a particular capability to defence, which defence desperately want. 7 years in, we still haven't managed to deliver it. Everything's in place. We can deliver it, but we haven't got to that point of actually deploying it.
Well, talking about education and tenure there as well, as we were just off camera a little bit as well. Government, you can have cabinet changes and leadership changes, and then everything gets reset. New budgets, new policies, new portfolios, and then where do we see
exactly
hold and wait again for another 6 months?
Yeah,
It's really fascinating. I'm always interested to find out about the people behind the business as well. Every time I think about Harman and AMX, honestly, I think about you. We've talked at many events now. We know a lot of the same people in the industry now. We share customers, like you say. But I'm always fascinated to find out how people got into AV, because it's not really something you go on Careers Day and say, I want to be in AV when I grow up. So how did you find yourself in this business?
So, like many people in this industry, my background is live music. My first job was in a record shop.
Right. In a record shop.
In a record shop. In Sydney, here in Sydney. I was working in the sound and lighting department, which is where we hired out little small sound systems, mobile disco systems.
I can picture those. As you say,
this is back in the early 80s.
You can only get like red, green, and yellow lights at that
pretty
point.
Pretty much, yes. Red, green, and yellow. Red, green, and blue.
And blue, sorry,
working with companies like Dynalite in those days, were making little now owned by Philips, were making little light chasers. The Technics SL 1200 was the turntable of choice.
You're talking,
so that was my first job out of high school, and my background has always been audio, electronics. I've played in bands since I was 15. Right. Still do.
What do you play?
Drums.
Nice. Okay, I was a drummer for about 10 minutes, I think.
Right. At my age, lumping a drum kit up and down the stairs at 2 o'clock in the morning is slightly more challenging than it was when I was 18.
It's not a great participation sport, is it?
It really is.
It's great for you doing it, but everybody else around, not so much.
It really isn't. Look, it's a great outlet, and it's my passion. But it gets harder the older you get. So anyway, a little bit like as we were discussing off mic, at school I was the sound guy for all of the productions. Yeah. So getting a job in a record store, working in the sound and lighting department, having that background, I then moved into design of nightclub lighting and audio systems. Yeah. It's where I got my first foray into sales and decided I didn't like it. Right. Literally left that job to join a very small startup installing smart boardrooms in 1988.
What?
So a smart boardroom in 1988 is very, very different.
Was that an electric projector screen coming down?
There was, believe it or not, this was fully integrated audiovisual.
You're kidding.
Based on slide projection.
Wow.
So multi-image slide projection.
Right.
Very, very comprehensive and powerful sound systems, fully automated lighting, fully automated blinds. So back in those days, the concept of a corporate video was incredibly expensive to create. So people created multi-image slide presentations, and that's what was delivered to, you brought a new customer into this beautiful boardroom, which was fully automated. You press the green button and the curtains would close, the screens would lower, the slide projections.
I can hear the noises.
Yes, clacky, 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 clacky. So that job was back on the tools after being.
So that was installation as well.
Design, installation, training, ongoing support, and this was AV was very much in its infancy. I mean, a video projector in those days was, $50,000 and around 300 lumens. So
and cables on remote still.
Absolutely. Yeah. A wireless remote control was that big.
Yeah.
But it was incredibly exciting.
Yeah.
To walk into these rooms and press a button and have this automated experience.
Pioneering times, Lots
of
change.
And it really, it set the groundwork for what we now know as smart rooms. Companies would have one of them. They were incredibly expensive, and I talk about back in those days, those of us in the AV were magicians. I mean, we could put a box on the roof and it could put a picture on a screen.
Witchcraft. Yeah.
It was witchcraft. You could quite literally walk into these rooms and people would just be amazed that this was even possible.
Like Spielberg calling his company Industrial Light and Magic
exactly.
for a reason.
Yeah.
Just, how is this even happening?
Yeah. So that was really how I got into AV, and it wasn't even called AV back then, as I say. The company, New Media Systems, Mike Dodds, who founded that company, sadly no longer with us. And he came out of, again, live audio production. He used to be a studio engineer for Split Enz in New Zealand.
Oh wow!
So I joined as his number one staff member. And we would create these incredibly complex spaces for large companies. As video projection became more and more affordable, the slide projection solutions tended to disappear and be replaced by slide projection. Rear projection was a big thing back then. And our background was very much audio, so a lot of our focus was on the audio side of it. We did, really quite, what is now done with a ceiling microphone and beamforming microphones. We did with, 60 microphones and 120 speakers in a ceiling, in a large, village green style of environment. That's obviously also where I first got involved with control systems. Right. So those early spaces were driven by the very first AMX control systems, which were quite literally multi-channel garage door openers.
Wow.
The remote control had
yeah.
all the buttons on it, and they clicked a relay, and then effectively that relay would trigger little sequences, and we would modify devices to allow it to be controlled from relays.
Now we're programming now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Then we moved into the actual programming environment. My first job as a programmer was triggered by Mike, my boss, coming back from the US and Infocom. The company that we were doing a bit of work with then had been acquired by AMX, and he dropped on my desk the Access Programming Manual and said, "Right, you need to learn this." Oh, wow. And it's funny, I talk about that era and the fact that there was no such thing as AV programmers. No. We could align a projector and we could move a jumper on a board or change a dip switch, but the idea of typing a line of code into a program, or in some cases literally into the front of the device, was unheard of.
I mean, programming itself is in its infancy.
Absolutely, very much so.
High-end it sounds.
And so we had this really interesting period where manufacturers like AMX and Crestron and others had to create this paradigm of AV programming. And they did it with, customized programs and customized tools and things that were really aimed at the AV technician, so people like me at the time, to take me from that, I can understand a block diagram, I can solder up an XLR, to someone who sat at a computer and typed lines of code.
Yeah. So there was so much change back then. I feel like we're only just now seeing the same amount of change as we did probably at that period in time. So what came next? Where did you
from there, the AV became much more popular. So we went from companies just having one of these big fancy rooms to a higher number. This is also when AV become proliferated into the university sector. A lot of the early work we did with AMX was actually in the university sector.
Right. Okay.
Simplifying these complex environments for academics to be able to use the technology. It's about that time that I moved out of integration into distribution.
Right.
So moved into the then distributor for AMX, a company called AVT or AV Technology.
Right.
And I was there for 22 years. My first job was to create and run the first local AMX programming training course.
Wow.
So,
well, at least you were on the money. That was where it was going.
It's where it was going. And as I say, I'd for the previous couple of years, I'd been building AV systems, project managing and programming these systems.
So you could see what was coming. This
absolutely.
Needed to scale, right?
And what we saw very quickly was that the way to scale was actually to educate the integration, the fledgling integration market. In the US, AMX had effectively said, well, we won't teach you how to do the programming. You come to us and we'll program it for you. Okay. But we saw back then that really was going to restrict our ability to scale. Yeah. And so we took the opposite approach of actually training our partners, our dealers, as they were called then. My first title was dealer manager.
Right, yeah. There's a lot of those titles around, wasn't it?
It's bizarre looking back on it. And so training was a massive part of what we did and how we grew the AMX brand in Australia. And yes, 22 years in that job, doing everything from training, sales, tech support. I ran marketing, I ran logistics. I had all sorts of interesting jobs along the way. Marketer secretly. I would never call myself a marketer. Me neither. Just as a drummer, I'm not allowed to call myself a musician. Yeah. But certainly, literally grew up with that AV industry. A lot of the people who are now in senior roles and running the AV companies are people who I trained as programmers back in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. So look, it's been a fascinating career. Now working for the company in Harman, actually being the face of AMX for many years is
certainly now that this goes out to the millions of viewers.
The millions and millions of people. It's certainly been an interesting ride and one that continues certainly with AMX and really the significant reimagining of what AMX is now as part of Harman. Yeah. But fundamentally, it's still doing what we always set out to do. It's simplifying technology for that end user.
Yeah, still solving the core problems.
Absolutely.
Just evolving a lot faster these days, I think. Okay, so I like to get retrospective sometimes, otherwise I can't see forward and try and think about mistakes, because I make quite a lot of them, as Paul will probably tell you. If you could speak to the version of yourself from 5 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, what would you say to Graham? Is there any advice? Would you just say, "You're doing all right, mate, keep on going, watch out for this"? Was there anything you'd do differently?
A lot's happened certainly in the last 5 years for me. The company that I was with for 22 years sadly imploded due to mental health at the end of the day. Right. Our owner went through a very difficult mental health period and the company was wrapped up as a result. Yeah. So could I have avoided that? If I'd gone and talked to myself 5 years ago, possibly not. I think if I look back to 7 years ago, one of the things that realizations I came to around that period was that your self-importance, is not tied up with your role or your job. You can be a fulfilled human being without a title and a huge team. And one of the things that I realised back then, with some help, was that as a contributor to the success of whatever you're doing, be that a company, as we're discussing, or a team, is as fulfilling as being perceived as the leader of that team. Because having been part of the leadership of that organisation for a long time, and of a very small leadership team, as the company grows and you tend to realise that some of what you do is actually not the best value for the company and also not the best value for you, it can be quite hard to let go of that. And looking back, I held on to a version of self-importance that
we've all been there, I think. Yeah.
That, in retrospect, had nothing to do with my personal or professional satisfaction, and very little to do with actual value to my employer, and certainly very little to do with value to my family at the time. So I think that was one of those light bulb moments for me at about that sort of 5 or 7 years ago. That doing what you love and what you're good at is much more important than your business card says or what you're perceived as being, as a leader or as a manager or any of those sorts of things.
Yeah.
And
we're
so
all fallible, right?
Absolutely. And we all strive. We all strive for. We all strive to be better and to be. To
lead
do
by
more,
example,
and all those sorts of things. And you can still do that without necessarily being the guy or the girl.
And thankfully, I think society's caught up now in that, it's okay to be flawed. I think
absolutely.
we've seen that workplace shift in the last probably decade, more so in the last 5 or 6 years, I guess, where, leaders pulls the same. I think probably software, I guess, was the genesis of it with the new, younger leadership crew coming through, sort of talking about it's okay to fail, and Zuckerberg with his, fail fast sort of philosophy. Paul certainly instills that it's okay to fail in here, and we learn from it and we move on.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you're restricting people. There's no innovation. So, and that's got to come from the top. You've got to be, look, we made a mistake there. Let's move on from it and learn. So, but that never used to be the way, did it?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Quite the opposite, in fact. Failure
seen as a character flaw,
and particularly if failure is personally laid at your feet, you have to defend yourself or defend your decision or whatever.
Not constructive.
No, not constructive. So I think that in terms of if I'd going back to that previous Graham who was terribly tied up with what was on his business card and terribly tied up with, this is the size of the team that reports to me, and terribly tied up with
building a little kingdom. And,
correct. Building the little empire, and frankly, doing a lot of stuff that I really didn't like and really wasn't very good at, because that was part of that. As part of that, I think the idea of following your passion and doing, when you get to a point where you are good at something, doing that and continuing to improve your skills or your capability or just your output, whatever it is much more important than, continually looking for that next step. And I think to your point earlier, I think that the modern workplace is very different in that, there is an understanding that, Fred is awesome at what he does. He doesn't want to be a manager. 10, 15 years ago, the only way you really progressed within a company was to become a manager, have a team, and then become a more senior manager and have a bigger team. And, particularly in the software world, it's like, Fred's really good at this. Yes, we're going to have to pay him a lot more than potentially the person he reports to.
But he's an excellent person at what he does.
He's excellent at what he does, and we need to just let him do that. And yes, we need to buy him a pizza every Friday because that's what makes him happy.
Exactly.
So I think that certainly looking back, that was a point in time where I really realised that a lot of what I'd been striving for was not what made me happy and not what delivered value. Yeah,
well, I think you're probably one of the lucky people that saw that then. You had the epiphany moment.
I was helped. I was helped. So as we talk about people you've worked with who've helped you. I mean, my leadership colleagues at the time at that company, a guy called Graham and a guy called Scott, sat me down and said, so this is what we want you to do and this is what we think is going to be the best value for the company. And I'm like, but hang on, what about all this? And they're like, yeah, but that's not important. This is what's important. This is what's going to make you happy and going to make us money.
Yeah. It's been huge for me. I've been really lucky and I've had some terrible bosses, but I've had some very, very good ones as well. And those very good leaders were your classic didn't get there by choice. They didn't want to be the leader, but they were very good at it and they were a natural leader, and they found themselves, thankfully, again, I guess because of the workplace they're in, recognizing that quality and they became leaders. And I was lucky enough to be, I guess, what you'd call a mentee, or they mentored me, and that got me through some of the same stuff that you were talking about. Too focused on career.
Yes.
What's next? Can I do this? Why can't I do that as good as the next person? To going, no, just you good at this. Just keep doing the things that you're good at, and everything else will flow. So we've learned a lot about you. So with all that in mind now, I'm really interested to hear stories from people in the industry who, because again, we keep going on about the fact that it's such a fast-paced industry. It moves daily, I think, at this point, especially now AI is here and everyone's sort of scrambling to figure out what's next and what software looks like next. But you've been in the industry a fair amount of years now. Has there ever been a point where you've just got close to that point of throwing your hands in the air and going, it's too much, it's too fast. What are we even doing here? Or reaching that point and then finding it as a great challenge to switch your problem solver abilities on and get through it. Has there been a point like that, or maybe multiple points?
I think, interestingly, it's yes, and it's relatively recent.
Right. Okay.
If we look at thinking back to what we talked about earlier, when the AV guys were magicians, and what we did was this incredible thing that no one else knew how to do, and putting big pictures on walls, and I say putting big pictures on walls, it sounds very trite.
It's effectively what it was, though, right? Yeah, when it's new.
But it was unheard of.
It's like showing an iPhone to a caveman to get...
Exactly right. So what I touched on this earlier, what we saw was this explosion of AV. And we went from it being something that was nice to have in one or two rooms to something must to have in every space. Yeah. And what that drove was a commoditization. And we're very much still in that space today. If we look at, a video conferencing room from 20 years ago, which is something I spent many years designing, delivering, making large amounts of money from, and compare that to a Microsoft Teams rooms today with a Logitech soundbar. Nothing against Logitech, it's a great product, but fundamentally that's a commoditized product. That's no longer an AV system, it's a commoditized product. And seeing that commoditization and that being perceived as AV, that's been difficult, I think, for the industry at large, because there's lots of people making a lot of money selling soundbars and installing displays, but it's not what we as an industry really do. We talk about the people who install systems in our industry are called integrators, because they take different products and they integrate them together to deliver a solution. Sticking a Logitech soundbar and plugging it into a Samsung display is not integration. So that commoditization kind of created a great pot of money for the industry, and still does. But it has, and it's not just the MTR. It's also sticking a
it's any device, really.
Sticking a sonic display on the wall and plugging an HDMI cable into it. It's saying that's AV. So as AV has got commoditized, the perceived value of really what we do in terms of that customized environment, that customized user interface, user experience, that ability to bring many devices together and integrate them, has almost become less valuable. We're kind of seeing that kick up again now. We're starting to see people going, no, I don't just want a Logitech soundbar. I actually want to be able to do X, Y, and Z. This cannot do that. How do you help me deliver that outcome? And particularly in things like teaching spaces, in defence, in courtrooms, and these are all markets. Right? These are all markets where AMX is very strong, because that's what we do. Is we enable the creation of these very complex, customized environments. So I think that that commoditization has allowed the industry to grow. It's made many people within the industry a lot of money, which is great, because we're a much wealthier industry now than we were. And what we're now seeing is a bit of a return to that desire for bespoke, custom environments. Now that doesn't mean that every single room is different, but it means that these rooms are not just an out-of-the-box experience. And as I say, I think we're seeing a return to that desire for a level of bespoke capability in these spaces.
That's fascinating. You'd want to say it's almost like the cycle that you see in most sectors, I guess, but it's probably, like everything else in our industry, different. I hear what you're saying. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, from my perspective as well, as I'm hearing you talking, I'm thinking, we've done all this work to, I guess, try and influence or push the industry towards standardization and extending life cycles and unlocking innovation and roadmaps. And then you get to the point where you're now looking at huge spaces with you just lists of brand names where you're sort of scratching your head going, okay, we can integrators must be going crazy, but from our perspective, just programming drivers and device drivers and trying to integrate something that is going to be highly available and
add all those sorts of complexities as well.
So you've gone full circle again to go, all right, we've streamlined, we've simplified, now we're going to expand and complicate again.
Yes.
So it's an interesting one. So so is that a challenge that you think you'd set up for, and that you've got? It sounds like you've got the answers. But
look, I think part of the challenge there is cost. People, and flat panel displays really drove that. All of a sudden you could have AV for $900. Some of the prices you can get a 65-inch display and an HDMI cable for. It's insane. But what people are realizing, and where companies like yours and ours deliver real value, is, okay, how can I guarantee this is up 100% of the time? How can I actually provide a level of information and data so the owners of that fleet can determine that they should replace that display or provide a different capability within the space?
Is there an opportunity? Is the thing actually energy heavy? And
correct. Can we simply turn the thing off at night and turn it on again in the morning? Believe it or not, that's what we've been doing as an AV industry for years, and we've now forgotten that is an important part of what we do. So look, I think certainly from our perspective, the cost of AV control systems used to be a real barrier. And whether it's an Innomate automation solution, whether it's an AMX solution, the per room cost was very high. That's now coming down. And that's allowing us to do things like provide much richer data to our users, provide that 100% uptime, provide that things like failover when there is issues. So yes, certainly speaking from an AMX perspective, that is our value proposition. That's what we do. And as we're seeing that tick up in demand, and I say tick up in demand, the demand's never gone away in those complex spaces. I mean, courtrooms, defence environments. I think the difference is, the average meeting room in a corporate environment is now they're starting to say, well, actually, we want a little bit more, not in every room, but in more and more rooms than just, an MTR.
Yeah. So I've got probably more of a personal question for you now from me. I mean, not a personal question, but a question that I've just thought of while I'm hearing you say that, because it's something that kind of confused me, at least for the first 6 months of working at Innomate. Because this is, AV for an outsider is a very complicated world. I'm a year back into this full time now, and there are still some nuances that get me every day.
I'm 38 years into it, and it still surprises me every day. Well, it's good to
know it's not just me. So it took me, and obviously answer this in any way you want, it took me a long time to get my head around the dynamic at play. There's a heap of boxes on the wall next to us. Black here. Boxes. This is one of our test labs, as well as being a pod studio. So for the first 6 months, I was going, so AMX, so are they a partner? Are they a competitor? Are they, do we consult together? Are we collaborating? Or is it all of these things? And I'm only just now realizing what the actual dynamic is, even though it's still very complicated. It's like the Facebook relationship status of it's complicated. But, we got on extremely well. We maybe are a little bit of all of those things on some days, and on other days, absolutely the opposite, because ultimately, as we talked about at the top, we're all trying to solve the same problems, and often for the same customer.
Absolutely.
So I'm keen to see how you think, what the dynamic is, because it's fascinating to me. And I guess because you mentioned us and Innomate, I don't want to make it an Innomate ad at all. We do some very similar things and some hugely different things with different people. What's the dynamic like to you? For example, if people ask you about Innomate, how do you explain the dynamic of how we work together?
So the first and most important thing to understand is Harman is a hardware company. We make those things. You're a software company. You don't. So immediately there's synergy. Because our value proposition to an end user is hardware. Yours is software.
For sure.
Yes, we can do some very similar things, but fundamentally, the only way to enable a user experience with your software is through somebody's hardware. So. My interest in Innomate from a very early time was they're going to need a hardware platform, not because they need to do control or they need to do a particular piece, but because fundamentally
it's got to control something. Right?
It's got to control something, and also, there is a barrier between a network and a human.
Yeah.
And microphone, speaker, amplifier, touch panel, networked AV devices are what bridge that gap.
Yeah.
So, yes, in the control space, you do some very similar things to what we do. But in terms of an outcome, you could have, a client who is, and there's several of these, who are 100% Innomate with 100% AMX and Harman hardware.
Yeah.
So, and that is a bit different. It's a bit of a different mindset for us because historically, AMX was the control glue within a lot of these environments, and still is in thousands around the world. But we're also seeing, solutions from companies like Innomate delivering value to the customer, which we can never deliver. Because as a hardware company, we make widgets, and we want that widget to be applicable to as many different applications as possible.
Yeah.
So that, controller sitting up there, which is a little bit long in the tooth.
Yeah.
You'll find one of those in a lecture theatre. You'll find one in a meeting room. You'll also find one in a museum. You'll also find one in a stadium. You'll find one in a. We've got AMX systems in tanks.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, that synergy between hardware and software is where I think. One of the reasons why we do work closely together. Yes, we do some similar things in different ways, and in some cases, the way that we do it is not the way the customer wants to do it, and they want to do it the Innomate way. But fundamentally, they still need that user interface. They still need an amplifier. They still need a speaker. They still need a display. They still need, all of those pieces of hardware that deliver your value proposition into that room or to that user. So that's where the synergy lies.
Yeah.
And yes, every now and then, there'll be, there's a lot of instances of your software running on our hardware. So, and that's a great example of the future, as I see it. The old way of tying an end user into a hardware and software ecosystem is, COVID killed that forever. And one of the big philosophical changes that happened when AMX was acquired by Harman was, okay, we're open to everyone. We move away from this walled garden. If our widget works for you with someone else's software, or our widget works for you with someone else's hardware, then we should both enable and support that through things like open APIs, through things like standards. So, that's a great, the Innomate AMX relationship is a great example of leveraging that. And, moving to the current generation of platforms, we're building hardware that you can write your software to run natively on. And what's more, we want you to do that. So it's a different philosophy, but to answer your question, hardware and software are required in any environment. And so for us, working with a company like Innomate makes great sense.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more as well. It's always fascinating to me as well especially when we're talking to new customers or, what we'd, call prospects, I guess, that, ultimately do tend to become customers, thankfully. It's interesting to see the response when there is a partner or a manufacturer mentioned, sometimes reluctantly, I guess, and our response is always, oh no, we know those guys very well, and would you like them to be in the next meeting, or because we are impartial, we have to stay impartial because of what we do, especially with the device agnosticity piece.
Yes,
we've got to, but we're in a lot of meetings together. Well, you and the company, and the same with other manufacturers as well. And I think that's a really nice, refreshing thing to receive as a customer, to know you're not being ganged up on, or there's no infighting between potential vendors that are going to come and try and solve your problem for you. And we see that every day. And it's a really good response, and it's nice. It's a nice environment to work in.
And it is. Look, it is a very different environment to even 5 or 6 years ago when every manufacturer, prior to the acquisition by Harman, AMX was here is our ecosystem. Buy into this ecosystem, and everything will be beautiful.
Unlock the door.
And that's just not the way that customers want to work anymore. They want to be able to either create or work with software vendors to deliver their back-end integrations or their UI UX components of it. They wanted to use best of breed in the various components that they use. And they won't brook, we don't have an API, so you can't use this product. I mean, I remember, one of the early meetings with Paul where I was talking about one of the products, and his first question to me was not, how does it work? How many inputs and outputs it's got? Does it have an API?
Yeah.
And you look at every new product that comes out from Harman at the moment. Yes, it's got an API, and here it is.
Yeah, we talked about that recently as well, didn't we?
So I think that's what's changed a lot in the last little while, and that's one of the reasons why that synergy between software and hardware is much less contentious than it was.
Yeah, I agree. A little bit of a fun one now, just to change gears. You can't go too far without talking about AI. I'm a big lover of it, and I welcome our AI overlords when they arrive, because they are listening now. But it's changing the world dramatically again. So, or large language model, whatever finicky you want to get about it. It's here to stay, and it's accelerating at a phenomenal rate. Obviously, we've got programs of work with AI. We're trying to diagnose issues using AI now, but there's still humans, helping the AI learn.
Yeah.
How quickly do you think it is going to change the big picture of our world? I still can't see a world where, a lecturer, for example, walks into a theatre and the room knows it's the lecture by persona, and it sets the lighting and all that sort of stuff. Right? Or, I don't know, are we close to that sort of an environment, do you think? Don't give away any trade secrets, obviously,
no,
if you've
look,
just
I think,
designed this secretly.
I think, it's really important to understand what people perceive as AI is often just really good programming.
Yeah, it's a large language.
It's a lot of the things that we've been doing in AV control for many years. This is an intelligent room. No, it's not.
Yeah, it turns itself on. Yeah.
Exactly. When I walk into the room, it knows I'm there and it turns it on. Yes, it's called a PIR sensor. So I'm really not sure how AI is going to impact AV specifically. I think, looking outside AV and looking at, things like programming, for example. Right now, our latest platforms support programming Python as one language.
Yeah.
If you can't get your Python program to work, you send it off to ChatGPT, it'll fix it for you.
Don't tell these guys that.
Exactly. Are we using AI in AV? Sure.
Yeah.
So some of that stuff that we don't even perceive as being AI, I think is intrinsically part of what we're doing today. How that will change the experience for someone in a meeting room or in a training space or an education environment, I'm not sure. My feeling is a lot of that is going to be behind the scenes, like leveraging AI to help complete programming tasks, like using those large language models to be able to send something off and get a response back, and then leverage that within the control environment.
Yeah, is the device getting sick? And
correct.
What variables and
correct.
Do we
and
see history?
I have, this is the data that I've collected from this device. What does this mean?
Yeah.
But that's very much sort of at an administration level or at a delivery level rather than a user experience level.
Yeah.
And I think that will continue to grow. As to how it affects the user experience, I honestly
Jury's
don't know.
out.
Yeah.
We touched earlier on, I guess some of the big turning points in AV, but I'm always keen to hear from people like yourself on trends that you're seeing. Yeah, we talked a little bit about Teams. Obviously, that you could have called that a trend for a little while.
Yes.
Again, I think the jury's still out. It does it serves a fantastic purpose. But what are you seeing, or what have you seen very recently in terms of a trend? Whether that be the constant strive for standardization still, or some organizations maybe turning that page from standardization and going, actually, no, we need to start looking back at fully bespoke rooms.
Yeah.
Anything like that that's on your radar right now?
Interestingly, it's the middle ground between the two.
Right. Okay.
What traditional control systems have done is delivered a user experience which is static.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing with the adoption of flow-based programming within control systems is the ability for the actual complex room intelligence to be delivered, in the same way that it always has by very clever programmers, yours ours,
robotic
integrators,
ones,
robotic AI ones, or whatever. But then and again, just making a distinction between the users and the actual administrators of the room.
Yeah.
So in your example, the AV team,
Yeah.
being able to, through a very simple visual interface, go and make minor changes to the user experience. So, in an AMX controlled room, for example, yes, all the code's been written by the integrator, all the hard work's been done. Obviously, the system, everything is integrated. It talks to each other. It reports back to potentially an Innomate system or whatever.
On the knockout.
But the actual the AV team is able to go, okay, in this room, even though in every other room we can wait 2 seconds and this happens and it works fine, in this room, for whatever reason, we want it to be 3 seconds, and being able to go into a visual interface and make those sorts of changes without impacting, obviously, the underlying code, because that's doing what it does. That is something that's incredibly exciting to the likes, those internal AV teams who are so used to the scenario of, we built this 5 years ago, and the only way we can change it is having someone come in and spend a lot of money to change it.
And do the life cycle rotation thing.
Correct. Yeah. So being able to iterate, being able to do things like, and I know this is a big Innomate thing, being able to replace a device mid-life cycle of a system. So, this is an NEC display here. We need to replace it with I don't know, there's probably a Samsung out there.
Somewhere,
and being able to do that through a simple web UI within the control system without calling in a programmer, without calling in a technician even.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's someone to physically change the display. Some of that sort of stuff, which, again, with traditional control systems is very difficult because everything is tied down into scripting and code. And allowing that a little bit of that middle ground between a standardized environment and a bespoke environment, and giving the administrator come AV people an ability to have some level of flexibility and capability in that is something that's particularly in large fleet owners. You're not going to do it in a corporate environment of 50 meeting rooms.
Yeah, exactly.
But where you've got a university of 1,000 classrooms where they do have a level of consistency, just being able to manage that, and then obviously report back to their integrator or to whoever is delivering the system, hey, listen, going forward, this is what we want this to do. And being able to do that in a sandpit style of manner. So when they're building their classroom of the future, giving the user the ability to actually create the UX and then bring that back to their programmer, be that Innomate or be that someone writing Extron or Crestron or AMX code, say this is what we want it to do. Some of this stuff becomes really, really fascinating,
and especially when it's data driven, right? As well, so you're
absolutely.
almost proving the proof point before you have to do any real, I guess, UAT or anything, because the data's showing you what needs to happen, and then with no impact to the organisation. Really.
Absolutely. And the other big thing that we're seeing is Innomate's a great example, is AV becoming a first-class citizen in the IT world.
Yeah.
So
we paid him to say that.
Well, and to be fair, Innomate is a great example. You obviously enable customers to do that, but some of our next generation platforms leverage off-the-shelf code modules to allow you to integrate with services and software that the end user is already using. Being able to integrate with data and analytics models and AI and various other components like that to deliver an outcome. Some of those sorts of things, which again have been incredibly complicated in the AV world because AV programming is so bespoke and so specific and frankly so dated. That ability to say, okay, I need to integrate with this business service it's unheard of. It's not what people do, and I know that's one of the value propositions that Innomate provides. But again, being able to do that at a per control system basis, literally a single box talking to a ticketing system.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. That's what still excites me every call, every meeting. I mean, when we start to explain what is possible now, and what's been possible for a few years with us, which you're aware of, and working with people like AMX and then sort of the instant reaction is disbelief. are you selling me vaporware? Is this a real thing? Because I don't think it's a real thing. And then we
Yeah.
show them and
that's the key, isn't it? And we've recently just come back from a tour around the country, demonstrating capabilities of our next generation control platform. And part of what we do is literally program up a system in front of them and say, this is what we want to do, everyone, right? Okay, here it is, it's done.
Yeah.
And people's brains are just blown.
Yeah.
And they're able to look at it and go, I understand that.
Yeah. It's the first time I think we're ever actually seeing that. It's the old, don't tell me you're funny, tell me a joke concept, isn't it? Oh, I can see it working. Okay. And people have just been sold software for so long now that it's, they approach from a cynical perspective. So, it's nice to see. I don't want to take up too much more of your time because I appreciate you coming anyway, but I've got probably just one, maybe two more quick questions. The first one really, and again, it doesn't have to be, a full detailed white labeled how-to guide, but you're going in, for example, to talk to a new potential customer tomorrow, a fairly large organization, government or education. What's the sort of first piece of advice that you would tend to try and give to people? Just very big picture, sort of blue sky thinking. So, to avoid some of the obvious traps that people get stuck in.
I think the piece that we regularly forget, and I touched on this earlier, is that AV is now intrinsically part of a business's operation.
Yeah.
It's mission critical.
Yeah.
So rather than starting with what widgets do you want in the room, some of the conversations we're having now is, what are your enterprise services and tools that you currently use? How do you know if your business is, that's going a bit too far. How do you know if the technology within your business is performing?
Yeah.
What do you currently use? What tools do you currently use? Is it a SolarWinds? Is it a Splunk? Is it right? Let's work from there down to your AV environment. How do we make sure that the AV environment is a first-class citizen within your system and service? Because the generally, if you're having the conversation at the correct level, as Innomate does, the people up here don't have any interest in AV as a separate entity within their environment. They just want it to be part of their technology ecosystem.
Yeah.
And so starting at that point and then working backwards is an important part of I think the modern AV conversation. And for a long time, it's not even been part of the conversation because it's been just too hard. Yeah. Okay, well, we use ServiceNow for ticketing. Okay. Great. Yeah. And being able to say, right, okay, so how would it be if the AV systems in your environment actually reported into ServiceNow and created tickets when there was failures? Can you do that? Yeah. And guess what? Here's an example, a demonstration of it. Some of those sorts of conversations, I think, fundamentally change the value proposition of AV, because displays, speakers, microphones, amplifiers, everyone can do that. But actually delivering true enterprise AV is actually having that conversation up at that level, not down at the, do you want a white or a black speaker?
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Okay, so final question to wrap it up. If AV could talk and became sentient, what's the first thing it would say in the morning?
It's a really interesting question. I think, and I did have to think about this quite hard when you sent me the notes earlier. Yeah. I think what AV would say to us today is, I want to be a grown-up. AV started off as a cottage industry by magicians, guys in black t-shirts standing on tables aligning projectors. Yeah. And then became this commoditized thing that everyone had, but has always been a second-class citizen to IT and the corporate services and all those sorts of things. So I think what AV wants to be is a grown-up. It wants to have a seat at the table with all of the other key platforms in an environment. Yeah.
Give me the car keys.
Exactly. So AV is as important as the network switch and the wireless access point and and frankly the lighting and the plumbing. Yeah. And I think that we're getting closer slowly.
Yeah, it feels that way.
But I think, you know, if AV is 13 or 14 now, it really wants to be 18, 9. It wants to be there. It wants to be a seater. It wants to be.
You can see the red Ferrari.
Correct. It wants to be the, you know, as important as an IT switch or as a light, frankly.
And so it should. Come on,
Absolutely.
AV. We can do it.
Absolutely.
Graham, thank you very much for coming in. It's been a pleasure. We'll have to do this again.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Cheers, Neil.